Hello students. Now in this lecture I'll begin with the explanation of the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden. I'll read out the entire section first. Like today I'll be dealing with the first section of the poem. As you all know by now that the poem is divided into 3 sections. So today I'll deal with the first section. I'll read out the entire section first, the text of this section, and I'll give you the meanings and then I'll explain the entire section together. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Oh, all the instruments agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. Now, before giving you the meanings, I would like to draw your attention towards this 5th line of the poem. Oh, all the instruments agree. Now, the text which you can see in this video, there the line reads, "What instruments we have agree." But the original text of the poem reads, "Oh, all the instruments agree." So, I would suggest you to go by the original line of this poem, that is, "Oh, all the instruments agree." Now, this line will be repeated again at the end of this poem. So, just mark that this correction in the poem, because this is the text which is mentioned in your strings of gold, which is the prescribed text in your syllabus. Okay. Now, dealing with these first 6 lines, let's see what are the difficult terms and the meanings too. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen. Brooks, small body of water, stream. Deserted. Deserted means empty. The mercury sank. Mercury here refers to barometer. In the mouth of the dying day. Dying day refers to the evening part of the day. Now coming to the next stanza of this section. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By moaning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Peasant means rustic, a farmer. Untempted, not charmed or lured. Quays. Quays means harbors. Now the third stanza of this section. But for him it was his last afternoon as himself. An afternoon of nurses and rumours. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. Provinces of his body. Provinces means his vital organs. Okay. The squares of his mind, the area occupied or conquered. The squares of his mind, the spaces in his mind where his thoughts ran, and they were invaded, they were conquered, they were occupied. The suburbs. Suburbs means outskirts. Now, next stanza. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood, and be punished under a foreign code of conscience, the words of a dead man. The words of a dead man refers to his poems. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living, but in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, A few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. Oh, all the instruments agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. Now, here again, I will request you to kindly note the change of the line. What instruments we have agree. Rather than this, instead of this, you have to read, oh, all the instruments agree. Now, coming to the word meanings. Modified. Modified means changed. Guts. Understanding. Then brokers, dealers. Bourse is a place of stock exchange. Okay. Now, coming to the meaning, the explanation of these lines. The first line of the poem, "He disappeared in the dead of winter," introduces a strong image of Yeats walking out alone into the darkness of winter. The desolation of the scene becomes stronger with each successive image. Not only nature, but the cold and mechanical works of man felt the passing of Yeats and thrust the reader step by step into the cold shock of the described day. Auden expresses doubts about the adequacy of human tools to measure or reflect upon the actual death of a man. If recording the death of the body is hard, it is much more difficult to commemorate the life of the mind and soul. Auden deliberately chooses to refer to Yeats as the poet, making him an anonymous figure rather than a specific man. Even the mourners are abstracted into mourning tongues, not specific people. In the absence of specific people in these lines, Yeats' poems themselves seem to take on a life of their own. Auden emphasizes Yeats' humanness by taking a glimpse into the world of hospitals and nurses and all the mundane things that we generally don't tend to think about when mourning a national figure. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. Auden turns to geographic and architectural language to describe human conditions. Yeats' body is described as a city at war with itself, a war it eventually loses. In death, even Yeats' poems change. They can no longer emerge for the poet's own mouth. Instead, they get modified in the guts of the living, in the understanding of the living, according to the understanding of the living people who read his poems. The human world goes on and on as usual. We wonder whether Yeats' death really outlives the evening news. The last two lines of the first stanza are repeated at the final two lines of the first section. This repetition underscores the fact that we hardly have adequate tools to tackle something as strange and complicated as death. So, in the first section, Auden discusses the death of W.B. Yeats in the dead of winter, a time when the brooks were all frozen over and snow made it difficult to make out the public statues. So, the public statues were disfigured by snow. It was so cold that the mercury in the barometers dropped. As Yeats lay ill and dying, the world and specifically Ireland went on as usual. When Yeats died, his death was kept from his poems. In other words, the poetry Yeats wrote remains unaltered by the fact that Yeats the man has now died. Auden then describes Yeats' death in the third stanza, concluding that with his passing, Yeats became his admirers. Once Yeats the man had ceased to be, Yeats the poet became whatever his readers and fans decided to think about him, to analyze about him, to interpret about him, what he was like. Here we can sense Auden making a broader point about the immortality of poets. They survive or don't survive depending on who reads them and how those readers interpret their works. Yeats' work is scattered all over the world in those cities where people read him, often finding surprising things in his work which Yeats himself would not recognize. Like he has used the phrase unfamiliar affections. Okay, so here we can say that many a time he is confronted with some surprising elements. Auden here is prefiguring one of the most influential ideas in 20th century literary criticism, that of the intentional fallacy or death of the author, where the worth and meaning of a writer lies with the reader rather than the author. Auden says that the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. We cannot help but change the meaning of what a poet wrote, adapting it to suit our own times and our own feelings and understanding. Auden concludes this first section of the poem by acknowledging that the world will go on tomorrow, but a few thousands will think of the day Yeats died as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. There is a refusal to indulge in sentimental public mourning here, and a classical downplaying of the importance of Yeats' death. It is important and noteworthy, but it is like a day on which one does something out of the ordinary, slightly different, rather than a dramatic day that changes everything. So that's all for the first section. Thank you.